We hope you enjoy this podcast. All our conversations are inspired by films we have selected to appear on SDG.vision. So go and take a look and be inspired by people and organisations who are making valuable contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals and making our world a better place for everybody to live. Now, sit back, enjoy, be inspired, and afterwards, go and take action.
Well, Tim Crabtree, Director of Wessex Community Assets, welcome to SDG Vision.
Nice to be here.
Great to have you. Great to have you here. First question I've got really is, where are you at this present moment in time, and where is Wessex?
That's a very good question. I'm in Bridport, which is a small market town in Dorset on the coast. About 15,000 people. I've lived here about 30 years, but I grew up in Dorset on the other side in Poole. So I am a sort of, a Dorset person. And Wessex, Wessex is interesting. We chose that name partly because it's a bit vague. And mainly we focus on Dorset, Devon and Somerset. But actually our work has extended up to Bristol, and sometimes a bit into bits of Wiltshire as well. But most of our work has been around Devon, Dorset and Somerset.
Great, that's terrific. I mean, those who have read Thomas Hardy will be familiar with what it is, but it's good to have it explained, I think. Now, you put a bit of a spanner in the works, Tim. We received an email from you just before this podcast, and it was a summary of your job experience and life experience. And I thought, my goodness, we could do just a whole session on your experience because it's fascinating. There's a wealth of experience there, but I'm sure some of it will come through. I'm sure they're all sort of formative experiences. One of them, of course, is Wessex Community Assets, and I think you were co-founder of Wessex Community Assets. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And could you tell us a little bit about the origins of the organisation, how it got started?
There was a group of people involved in community enterprise and social enterprise in Devon, Dorset and Somerset that met on a regular basis in the 1990s, I guess. And we used to get input from one of my old colleagues from the New Economics Foundation. It's a guy called Pat Connerty, an American guy who had this amazing role, I suppose, of bringing across from America ideas of initiatives that we didn't currently have in the UK, but which he felt, were an important part of the sort of community economy in the States. So one of those was community land trusts, and the other one was community development finance initiatives. And this group of peers, we were all finding in the work that we were doing, whether it was around local food systems or community renewables or community housing, for example, that access to finance and access to land were critical issues, but really challenging for all of us and for the people that we were working with as well. And so we decided, with Pat Connerty's support, to set up this kind of secondary structure, which was conceived as a cross between a community land trust and a community development finance initiative. The reason, its original name was Wessex Reinvestment Trust. And so part of the rationale there was to encourage the sort of recirculation of money in a region rather than seeing that money being put into banks and then going off to other areas. So that was one aspect. And in terms of the land, well, obviously, for housing, for food and farming, for many other issues, access to land is really challenging. But we needed support in doing that. And we felt it was kind of logical to have a joint secondary structure to help us with both land and finance So that was the sort of origins, I guess, of Wessex.
It's interesting, isn't it? We've recently interviewed somebody from the Lopez Community Land Trust, which is in the sort of the northwest of America, and it'll be really fascinating actually to see the similarities and perhaps the differences also in terms of the work that you do and they do. But one thing's clear that it's not just an American model anymore, and a lot of this learning is coming to fruition now in terms of both America and Britain and Europe learning from each other. Obviously, I suppose foundationally, the basis of your work is ecological concerns. And perhaps you could talk us through about Wessex Community Assets' ecological values and how it informs your work.
Sure. That's another big question. So I think I'd say there's two dimensions to that. One is a dimension that it goes back to my work with New Economics Foundation, which is that when I was there, we hosted an economist from Chile called Manfred Max Neef, and he had worked with colleagues in a Latin American context on what they described as human scale development. And without going into it, in too much detail, he basically said that people have a basic set of needs, but those needs are then satisfied in different contexts, in different ways, because of cultural differences, etc. So this idea of needs and then satisfiers. And one of the critical needs is the need for subsistence. And the other needs are things like protection, affection, cooperation, those sorts of things. And you can sort of get synergistic satisfiers. It's a really interesting idea, but as an economist, or as somebody with a training as an economist, I sort of had enough of theory and policy, and I wanted to do something practical. And it struck me that when you look at subsistence, the key elements of subsistence are food, warmth, shelter. So that's food and farming, housing, energy, clothing. And that's what I decided to focus on. But then those four elements, they all draw on the environment for their materials. They have an impact on the environment. And it then raises questions about how we do that in a sustainable way or a regenerative way. So it kind of made economics, it sort of made sense for me. Okay, let's just focus on those basic foundational elements of provisioning for subsistence. So that's kind of what I've done for the last 30 years. So, I focused on those areas. And because of that environmental connection, I guess issues around sustainability and where we get our resources from, so issues around bioregional approaches, all those kind of things came to the fore. So that's kind of one dimension of the environmental side of Wessex, and it, can lead on to a sort of technical side about, how many resources do we have available in a local area, how can we enhance that, etc. But then there's another dimension which we've been exploring in relation to housing, for example, the last 6 or 7 years. And that's to do with what's our actual relationship or engagement with the environment. And so a lot of our work has been getting people working with timber or working with clay or working with fibers like flax or hemp. Because I think unless people have that sort of embodied engagement with materials, they'll always see the environment as kind of something separate. And so I think it's only when we really develop that close relationship with the environment that our values actually shift. Otherwise, it's just a sort of technical or theoretical approach to the environment. And I don't think it goes far enough. So I guess for me, that also builds on the work that I did around food and farming, that it was always around how do we get people out to farms? How do we get people meeting with farmers? How do we get people growing and cooking food? And, it led into, social enterprises of different forms, but it always had that foundation of we've got to engage, practically and closely with the environment. So I think you have to have those two dimensions that go hand in hand.
It's sort of theory and practice, or praxis, or whatever you want to call it, I suppose. But it's really interesting, actually, because the Lopez Community Land Trust, I thought one interesting aspect of their process of building community homes was what they call sweat equity, which is, people who are going to live in their houses actually get involved in the process of construction of their own houses. And I think that speaks a little bit as to what you're saying, that it's a process of getting to see nature and the environment as part of us, as integral to our lives as anything else, probably more real than anything else. So that I think that's really interesting. One I suppose foundational issue that is possibly interesting for people who've never heard about community assets is what's the philosophy behind it? Why is community assets, why is communal ownership of assets important, do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, lots of dimensions. I mean, I think one dimension is that we need kind of social infrastructure in our communities. And so, everything from social clubs to, workspaces to community halls, all of these things are important. And what we've seen over the last 40 years is a lot of those spaces being lost through privatization or, local authorities having to sell them off or whatever. So I think, one aspect of community assets is to put those assets in trust so that they're there in perpetuity. I think secondly, I worked a lot with development trusts, and one of the key ideas there was that development trusts can act as anchor institutions. And, so they might offer workspace, they might develop training programs, they might do housing or whatever. But the idea was that they should develop an asset base that would then generate them incomes so that they don't, in the long term, stay grant dependent. So that notion of sort of, building an asset base, developing as anchor institutions was really important, when I was sort of involved in that kind of work. Then I think there's a more sort of fundamental dimension to it. So if you take community land trust housing, for example, if you look back at the last 40 years, we've lost something like 3 million houses through right to buy. And then the government tries to sort of respond to the consequent lack of affordable housing, something like 8 million people, requiring affordable housing. Another 4 million units need to be built by, say, like subsidizing individuals, so that they can buy their first home. But the problem there is that initial subsidy is then lost, and it's not sort of captured in perpetuity. So there's this question that I think community land trusts in the States sort of grappled with was, okay, how do we deal with that? And so one of the sort of principles is that if you take it to housing, when you build a house, there's the house and there's the land. And it's quite interesting. If you look at the cost of building houses over the last, it's been a funny 10 years, but still it sort of follows inflation. Okay. But the actual cost on the market of housing has gone up almost exponentially. And so, the ratio between incomes and house prices has really gone up. And so the issue is not so much the bricks and mortars, though, we can come back to that. The issue is about land. And land is in effect a sort of speculative asset. And it's become even more of a speculative asset over the last 40 years because of the deregulation of the financial industry, the development of, financial products, etc., the encouragement of people to invest in property rather than productive assets. And so the whole point with community land trusts is to say, okay, if the land is the problem, how do we take land out of the market, hold it in trust, and then that value that is in the land can be taken out of the cost of the housing, whether that's buying the house, leasing the house, renting the house, or whatever. So this is what, has been developed in the States, and it's what we then sought to bring to the UK, working with people like New Economics Foundation. The challenge in the UK is we have a different legal system to the US. So in the US, a community land trust, they hold the freehold of the land, but then they have a 99-year full repairing lease on the property. And in this country, you can't do that because of leasehold enfranchisement. And so the initial proposal was that a community land trust in the UK would lease to a cooperative, a mutual home ownership society, because then you can't get leasehold enfranchisement. Sorry, this is a bit boring and technical, but it's kind of important. That proved to be very difficult to get support for because banks didn't like the idea. And so community land trusts, and I think Wessex, as a sort of pioneer of community land trust housing, is sort of partly responsible for this, sadly. It sort of said, okay, well, we need finance to build the houses. The only way we can do that is to get money from the government. You have to get the money through Homes England, but to get the money through Homes England, you have to be a housing association, a registered provider. But most of the small community groups setting up community land trusts didn't want to go through that process. So then these community land trusts then ended up in partnerships with existing housing associations. So that delivered social rent housing, but it meant that the actual houses themselves belonged to the housing association. And so those individual community land trusts found it incredibly difficult to then go on to their next project because they didn't have assets that they could use to borrow the next tranche of money. So those partnerships with housing associations, at one level, strategically proved useful to get more projects off the ground. But now the sector has hit a bit of a block because it doesn't have capacity itself. It doesn't have these assets to be able to go on and do more developments, which is what happened with housing associations as they grew. So we're in a sort of funny situation, and that's why Wessex, over the last few years, we've sort of started to develop new approaches away from these partnerships with housing associations to try and find different ways. Sorry, that's a rather convoluted answer to your question, but it's a complicated issue.
It's not at all. It really strikes to the heart of the matter, isn't it? Doesn't it, in the sense that, a community asset should be owned in perpetuity by an organisation that's rooted in the community. And so where are we at the moment then, Tim? I mean, so take, for example, the housing that you develop, Wessex develops. Is that owned by Wessex Community Assets, or is it, again, still in partnership? Have you found that middle way?
No, but we're trying. No, I mean, Wessex, we've mostly operated as a sort of enabling organisation. So from about 2003, 2004, when we sort of got going, we provided support to a whole range of small community housing groups. So probably about 60 community housing groups. Good half of those have delivered projects, but as I say, mostly in partnership with a housing association. About 2 years ago, we floated off a community interest company to carry on that particular support work with community land trusts and housing associations. And we put all of our energy into new forms of community housing. So the kind of forms that we're interested in are things like self-build or self-finish, but also where a community land trust could acquire a property in a different way, in some way, and then retrofit it and then make it available to people for affordable housing.
So it doesn't. I mean, so at the moment it seems quite fluid and experimental. Trying to find that way of a community owned in perpetuity. Is that right, or is it it's still struggling to reach that stage in the UK? Because there's no legal basis behind it, presumably, at the moment.
There is a legal basis. So, for example, we're working at the moment with a project in Plymouth. It's a small project. It's got planning permission for 10 houses, and what we're looking at is sort of two potentially innovative dimensions. So the first dimension is to say, how do we support the community to construct the housing in a way that local people can be involved through training, through apprenticeships? And so we've been working with Plymouth University and an organisation called Open Systems Lab, and they've developed an open source construction process called WikiHouse. And with WikiHouse, basically you take sheet material and a CNC machine, you cut out parts on the CNC machine from the sheet material, and then anybody can sort of slot those together, a bit like Lego, and then you can make a structural frame, and then you can do everything else that's required to complete the building. So it's a very accessible form of construction. And in this, we're following a really interesting community housing group in Bristol called We Can Make. They've done a similar thing with a couple of initial houses. They're just moving on to their next houses. And so we've created a sort of learning partnership with We Can Make. And then, so that's one dimension of it. And then the other dimension of it is this issue of how do you get the government subsidy to allow the housing to be rented for social rent? Because the area that we're working in is, it's a peripheral housing estate. It's one of the poorest neighbourhoods in the southwest. And social rent is the only thing that's viable for the people in housing need in that area. But obviously that means in the long term, you're bringing in less income over the next 25 years. And so you need government grant to make that work. But as I said, the only way you can get the government grant is if you're a registered provider of housing, a housing association. But the group, this small community group, it's such a bureaucratic process. They don't want to go through that application process and take all on the responsibilities. So the second innovation that we're looking at is whether it's possible to have a secondary structure, either for Plymouth or for the Southwest. So basically a housing association owned by a number of community housing groups that would access the funding, but then be co-owned by those community housing groups. So the value of those grants would then be, owned partly but by those different community housing groups. So that's the second sort of thing that we're looking at. So it's how do we do the innovative construction, but also how do we do innovative financing to allow this to happen?
It's a complicated process you're engaged. It's not only practical hands-on stuff, but it's also acting in an advisory capacity and trying to work out in partnership new ways of delivering and making things possible. I know that you do a lot of workshops and training. I was going to ask a question about your activities, and you've spoken to that quite a bit already, I think. Your workshops and your training, is it quite varied in terms of practical workshops and as you suggested, workshops around sort of legal frameworks, or not perhaps legal frameworks, but enabling frameworks in terms of uh, realizing community assets. If you could just explain to us what your workshops, your training elements are, that would be interesting.
Yeah, I guess it goes back a bit to that answer that I gave about environmental values. So on the one hand, we do training around, legal structures, business planning, theory of change, all those sort of standard things, financing, because you need those building blocks for any initiative. We do quite a lot of work around community shares as a financing mechanism, because when we set up Wessex as a community development finance initiative, although we started with a couple of loan funds, we soon realised that there's a limitation. There are limitations around loan finance, and we wanted to develop other approaches. So we actually did the pilot work around community shares, and community shares, they're issued usually by a community benefit society. We set up a registration service for community benefit societies and registered about 150, and then we advised people how they could use that vehicle to do a community share offer and then use that to raise quite significant sums of money for community energy or housing or food and farming, for example. So we do that kind of training, but equally we also want to, as I say, make things kind of practical. And because there is this strong environmental dimension, we've done things like workshops in sustainable construction for unemployed people to teach them skills. And then, it's great. You see some of those people going on to get jobs in, carpentry companies or whatever. We, out of this work that we've done exploring the role of sort of natural materials and local materials in construction, we've also done a lot of work with local farmers, sort of exploring agroforestry. How can we get more timber into construction? And then that sort of took us into fibers. Was it possible to grow fibers? And we started with hemp, which is a really interesting, potential building material. And the last year we did a lot of work around flax as well. But we always build into that work sort of practical workshops, whether for the farmers, but also for the local community. And we get a lot of interest in people coming to, come and explore working with clay or hemp or flax or timber. Because there is this, I think there's a lot of interest in making, in materials. And so I think we've been able to contribute in that space as well by sort of offering these much more practical workshops as well.
And how do you do that out of interest? I mean, say you're working with a farmer and you say, well, we like to include the community in that. How does that process work typically? I guess it's different for each place.
I mean, a good example would have been last year where we were growing flax with 3 farmers, and one of the farms, it was only about an acre on this particular farm, but it's a very sort of well-established, well-loved farm. right on the coast, so it's very beautiful as well. And they're very good at getting people to come out, to help plant trees or whatever. Anyway, we were growing this acre of flax, and the traditional way that you would harvest flax is through flax pulling. So you'd have a whole set of people in a line, and they'd go up the field pulling the flax out of the ground by hand and then bundling them up. And yeah, twice we managed to get so many people to come out to help with this flax pulling. Because it's a nice community event. It's in a beautiful space. So I think that that's something we're lucky about. We're in West Dorset. It's very nice to go out to the farms and do that. So that would be one example. Otherwise, we run, either more, we've it's interesting actually, when we were growing hemp, although we started by looking at construction, we were surprised how many people approached us who were involved in like spinning and weaving. There's so many people involved in spinning and weaving. You wouldn't realize, but I didn't realize. And they kept saying, "Oh, we've read so much about hemp, but we've never actually worked with it. Could we come, and try it out?" So then that led to a series of workshops. About sort of, anyway, it's quite an interesting process, breaking the woody core from the fiber and then heckling it and spinning it, etc., etc. And actually, out of that, over the last year, we ended up in a very interesting network across the Southwest, and have just got funding to develop a sort of fiber processing cooperative that will work with farmers, but right through to the other end, designing products and then selling products. So that's a sort of a funny, unexpected offshoot of something starting somewhere and then ending somewhere else. But it was interesting.
I suspect, by the sounds of it, there's a lot of these little offshoots that have been generated by Wessex Community Assets, and that's lovely, actually, that you can enable that. Now, my colleague and the founder of SDG Vision, Gary Battelle, he won't forgive me if I don't go into exploring what hemp is and why it's important. He's a great believer in hemp and the future of hemp, sustainable material. Could you perhaps educate us about hemp and why it's so important as a sustainable material?
So hemp is a very interesting crop. It's one of the fastest growing crops, probably behind bamboo, but certainly incredibly fast growing. So over a 3-month growing period, it's just incredible. It can grow to 12 to 15 feet. It grows sort of very densely. So, so it suppresses weeds. So it's good if you've got say like an arable rotation in a farm. It can be very good as part of a cycle, a rotational cycle as a break crop, because it suppresses weeds during that growing season. The following crop doesn't suffer so much from weeds. So that's good. It sequesters carbon something like 13 times quicker than trees. And so if you can then lock the carbon up in, say, using the fibers for textiles or rope or things like that, or it's got a woody core, which has very good insulative properties. So if you mix that with lime or clay, then you're basically locking that carbon up, but you're also creating a very good insulating thing. So it's got all these different uses. The reason we got interested was for 2 reasons. One was at Plymouth University, they have a project that has been looking at cob, which is a traditional building method in the Southwest where you mix clay and straw to make walls. And they've come up with a new version of cob that meets building regulations. But the best insulating element they found to mix with the clay was hemp. So that made us interested. And the other thing was that I said that I live in Bridport. So Bridport traditionally was one of the key centres for the making of rope and net over the last, 6 or 7 centuries. And there's still a rope and net industry in Bridport. And the traditional raw material for rope and nets was hemp and flax. So we have all this old infrastructure that's no longer used to process hemp and flax. A lot of the names of streets and buildings have hemp and flax in them. So historically, for us in Bridport, it's really important. And so when we went to the farmers and said, let's grow some hemp, they sort of said, oh, that's interesting. I remember my grandparents, talking about hemp, or maybe even could remember a hemp harvest or a flax harvest. So they were sort of intrigued because of that cultural connection, and that made it easier to persuade them to grow hemp. There's a thing called Farming in Protected Landscapes, a grant fund, and we managed to get 3 years funding from the Dorset National Landscape team. So that was very helpful. That was for 3 years of trials. So it was a construction variety, a seed variety. We made oil the second year, and then the third year was a textile variety. So that's hemp. So the other thing to say about it is that it also has its challenges, because to be able to grow it, you need to get a license from the Home Office Drugs and Firearms Agency. Because in the 1920s or 30s, there were various people who were developing products that previously had been made from hemp, but that were starting to be made from petrochemicals. Or, for example, hemp used to be the main ingredient for paper, but then you had newspaper barons who would be buying up forests and using pulp from trees to make paper. So there was a quite concerted campaign to undermine hemp. And so what they did is they conflated industrial hemp, which is cannabis sativa, with marijuana, and said they're the same things, and therefore we must ban both of them. And that was really successful. And so as a result of that, industrial hemp, which, as I say, we've been growing for centuries in this country, suddenly was banned, and then only, 30 years ago, was allowed to be grown, but under these very restrictive regime. So it's been quite a challenge to bring it back. It's very frustrating because, interestingly, just yesterday, the Prime Minister was down in Cornwall meeting with King Charles, visiting a Duchy of Cornwall housing estate near Newquay. And it's a timber frame development, but the insulation is hemp. So, but I bet if you ask the Prime Minister or King Charles, do you understand all these restrictions that currently exist for actually growing this material? They wouldn't be aware. So there's a lot of work to do. But ultimately, we have to replace petrochemical-based insulation. Hemp has this amazing role potentially in terms of carbon sequestration. It's a great crop as part of a wider regenerative farming system. So hopefully it will get there.
Is the process for farmers, quite time consuming in terms of getting a certificate, or is it fairly straightforward?
Well, we did it all for them. So for the farmers, it was quite easy, but for my colleague, it was a real pain.
If I was a farmer, for example, and I wanted to grow a field of hemp, would it take a lot of my time?
It's doable. I think the challenge is, on the one hand, is getting a contract from a processor so that you're sure you're going to be able to sell your product at the end of the harvest. And the other is it's very difficult to get seed. You're not allowed to save seed. There's no company in the UK currently producing seed, so that has to be imported from Europe. And that's also very difficult.
Yeah. I can imagine. Goodness, I mean, that's absolutely fascinating. But, as you say, it's on the journey to a more sustainable economy, hemp really can play a critical role, can't it? I was going to ask about an initiative I saw on your website called Raise the Roof. And I wonder if you could talk about that. Maybe you've touched upon it already.
Yeah, so Raise the Roof, it started because about 6 or 7 years ago, an organisation in Dorset called Dorset Community Action, it had some lottery funding, and it was all about how to support community resilience in the face of climate change. Anyway, so they had some spare money. Probably shouldn't say this, but they had some spare money, and they were looking for proposals. And I proposed that we could do some research into whether there is a potential supply of local natural materials that could be used for construction, particularly in community housing. So I did that piece of research. That was sort of 2017. And for that piece of research, we set up a working group. And one of the members of that working group worked for the Architectural Association. We're very lucky in West Dorset. There's this college called Hook Park, which the Architectural Association run, and it's about the use of timber in construction. So, and there was a kind of college that was the precursor to that. So we've got this amazing history in West Dorset of people exploring the use of timber in construction. And then other people sort of who were involved in things like the use of straw or clay or other things also joined that group. Anyway, so then we were then approached by this national group of architects called Assemble Studio. And anyway, about 10 years ago, they worked with a community land trust in Liverpool called Granby 4 Streets on a refurbishment of a terrace of housing. And as part of that process, they had set up a community workshop to recycle materials into nice products. They won the Turner Contemporary Prize for that, Contemporary Art Prize. Anyway, so they approached Wessex and said, we're interested in what you're doing and we'd like to work with you. And we didn't have any money, but because they'd won this art prize, we went to the Arts Council and said, would you fund us to work with Assemble for them to do a bit more kind of strategic thinking about about the use of local materials in construction? Strangely, the Arts Council said yes. And we called that next iteration of the project Raise the Roof. I think the reason for that was because one of our partners is a charity called Common Ground that has done a lot of work around sort of local distinctiveness. And they'd done a project in Wales where there's this idea that if you can build a building in 24 hours on a piece of land, you can live there forever. And they'd done a little project like that. And anyway, so the idea of Raise the Roof had been circulating. So we called the project Raise the Roof. So the first iteration, as I say, was a bit more sort of research and strategic thinking. But from that, we then said, well, that's not enough. We need to be doing practical prototyping. So we then got some funding to do some practical workshops with unemployed people, building tiny houses. Then we got some funding via the University of Plymouth. And that was to say, how do we integrate natural materials with modern methods of construction? So like digital fabrication, off-site fabrication, that sort of thing. Yeah, so that project has sort of, it's sort of continued. I think now we've just got a bit more funding to work with Assemble. So the project is sort of continuing. The project at the moment is saying, is it possible to get small sites from, say, the town council and do medium density housing on that site? So they're doing designs for sort of medium density housing that might host 20 people. And anyway, we'll see where that goes. Depends on council releasing money, land for housing and getting the financing. But so the project is sort of keeping going, but it's kind of evolved over time.
Have you seen? Has there been an increased interest in the work that you're doing in the years since you've been running? Do you think there's a will to engage in more sort of natural construction, or using natural materials for construction, and the whole issue of community assets?
I think if you take community housing, I'd say at the moment it's in a lull because there was a community housing fund, quite significant community housing fund, about 300 million, that the previous government released over 2 tranches from 2015, and that really supported activity. But that finished about 3 years ago, and that was supporting projects on the ground, but it was also supporting enabling organizations like ourselves and others. So without that kind of support, it is quite challenging to keep things going. And I think there was this strategic error also, I think, of putting too many eggs into the baskets of housing associations, so that the sector doesn't have the assets to borrow against to do its own projects going forward. So it's still grant dependent. It's still looking for funding. So I think that's a challenge. I think there are other sectors that are looking a bit more hopeful. So I think that community energy is, the government has included community energy in the new local energy bill. There's going to be 400 million of low-cost loans available for community energy groups, and there's going to be hopefully a new round of the community energy fund sort of development funding that was made available. So hopefully that will help that sector. I think in terms of community assets, there was a community ownership fund, but again, that finished in December. And I think if the government is serious about the role of community assets in terms of, maintaining social infrastructure, that needs to be brought back. So that's going to be really important. Because I think, it's really important that you have these partnerships between the community and the state, whether it's local government or national government. But I'm not, at the moment, I'm a bit concerned. I think the messages are a bit mixed from the government. I think there are some areas like energy where it's very positive. Housing, I'm not sure. Community assets, I'm not sure. So we're at an interesting juncture. One only has to hope that, maybe with the spending review, that things will start getting better after that.
And I mean, is it who is sort of trying to, or what agency or organisation or network? Maybe it's Wessex Community Assets. Is trying to sort of speak into the ear of government. How does that process? Is there an agency, or are you it that is doing that? Is there a united voice that's speaking to government at local, regional, and national level?
I think there are national organisations. So you have organisations like Power to Change, Local Trust, Locality, within the space of community assets. For example, you have things like Community Energy England, sort of sector-specific bodies that are doing their lobbying. In terms of housing, there was a national consortium, community-led homes, which represented, housing co-ops, co-housing, self-build and community land trusts, but that dissolved because the funding went. So again, there isn't such a strong voice at the moment for that sector. Whether or not local and regional organisations have enough support to be able to get their voice heard, either within those national representative organisations or direct to government, probably not, because it's very difficult to get core funding for organisations at a local level, and therefore it's very difficult to spend the time being present in London generally, doing that sort of work. So it's, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, there was a set of regional infrastructures that we were strongly part of. But again, those were dismantled by the last government. So that's made it harder for us to sort of have that kind of political engagement. It's a shame, I think, but it's, yeah.
And it's sad that it often comes down to funding, doesn't it? As you say, core funding in particular, to enable that process to continue, and for it to be coherent. That's tricky. No, we think the work of Wessex Community Assets is really important, and we think it's contributing on a significant level, really, regionally and nationally in the UK, to the Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Were the SDGs something that you've been aware of and using as a framework, or do you see it as a possible framework that you could use?
When I worked at New Economics Foundation, we were very involved in the, the World Council on Sustainable Development, I think it was, that led up to Rio in 1992. And then you had things like Agenda 21, which had a long, a sort of quite an influence at a local level, local Agenda 21. And so I see the SDGs as sort of continuation of those kind of processes. And I think that, possibly for sort of kind of more national organizations or sort of bigger corporations, I think the SDGs have been important and therefore create a framework that says you need to be looking at all these different dimensions. So I think for us, we certainly try to report against all the different impacts that we hopefully deliver. We don't explicitly use the SDGs, but we see them kind of as an important part of that range of things, within the world of ESG and corporate social responsibility and other sort of indicators that we need to be trying to address. So we don't explicitly use them in our kind of reporting, but we see them as an important part of this broader landscape that we need to be addressing, because otherwise, the focus is just GDP growth and trickle down.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that it does allow for that conversation. I mean, it's really interesting listening to you talk about the work Wessex Community Assets does, because I think it speaks to the SDGs in the sense that you hit a lot of them. You've talked about affordable housing, which is SDG 1, no poverty, good health and well-being. You've talked about SDG 3, which is, the process of engagement with nature and working with natural materials. Quality education, which I think you're engaged with, SDG 4. A lot of your work is about education in workshops, etc. Climate action, of course, SDG 13. And it's life on land, SDG 15. I could go on, but I think that's the value of the SDGs, is that it sees things as interrelated. And as you say, if we're just valuing the economy's values are just on GDP, then that really is just skimming the surface of what's important in life and what it takes for humans to live meaningful lives and healthy lives. It's been terrific talking with you. Have we missed out on anything at all, Tim, that you would like to cover?
Well, the only thing I'd mention is that one of the main projects we've been working on this last year has been a joint project with Dorset Community Energy around retrofit, because one of the things that we came to sort of realize with the work that we were doing with community housing is that it's very difficult to see how we build our way out of the crisis. I mean, building houses is important, but there's an existing housing stock. And on the one hand, if it's possible to bring some of that housing stock into community asset ownership, that could be really important. But secondly, the estimate is something like 28 million existing homes need retrofitting. And so there's a big job to be done there. And so for Dorset Community Energy, we decided that retrofit should be a real priority for the work that we do, not just putting PV onto schools and hospitals, which is important, but it's not enough. And then for Wessex, as I say, it's sort of linked to this idea that community housing should also be sort of looking at existing housing stock and taking ownership of that and improving that. So we're currently just coming to the end of a 1-year sort of research process into setting up a retrofit service, and also potentially a social enterprise that would offer training to people where we take on a house, they get trained in, all the trades. We retrofit the building, and then it's available for affordable housing after that. So that's the other main project, I guess, we've been doing over the last 12 months.
That's great. And I think that sort of part of that is SDG 7, affordable and clean energy as well. So that's another one you've added to your long list. That's terrific. Thank you, Tim. Now, we've got a film of yours. So that's why we were interested in your work. We saw a film called Community Land Trusts, Creating More Sustainable Communities. And we've put that under SDG 11, and we'll put it at the end of this podcast interview as well. Obviously, we'll hear from you again, I hope, Tim, because obviously it's an ongoing process. Really important work that you're engaged with. There's a lot more to be done, obviously, in terms of the work that you do. But it seems that you cover a lot of ground in terms of practical engagement, but also putting pressure on for at the level of strategic level as well, which is much needed. So thank you very much for sparing the time. You're obviously very busy, and talk to us again.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you, Tim. Bye-bye.
My name's Paul Sander-Jackson, and I'm chair of Wessex Community Assets, and I was one of the founder directors of the organisation in the early 2000s. We were set up in response to the need to find ways of getting communities in rural areas initially access to a variety of resources, finance, land, the things that they needed to have control over elements of their life to maintain the resilience of their communities. And we've been exploring that in different ways, but just recently we've come to focus very strongly on the affordable housing sector, particularly using the model of the Community Land Trust. People are interested in, what is a community land trust? What does it mean? And to me, I suppose I came across it, in quite early days, and the essential element is that land has been made into a commodity in our country, whether it's farmland or housing land, and it's got a premium value. and that value does not reflect its use value, and it's had the effect of massively inflating house prices and the price of agricultural land, so that both of them for different sectors are unaffordable to people who either need to live in an affordable house or need to work land to produce food at affordable prices. So the principle of the community land trust is to take the value of the land and endow the community with that land and the stewarding of that land for the future, and take it out of a commodity market, if you like. So in the case of housing, I mean, land value represents at least a third of house prices and house value. So if you capture a value of land at a very low rate, or ideally at no cost at all, and then put it into community stewardship for the long term, you're taking out a significant ingredient in house prices, and that allows the community to then develop that land into housing at a much more affordable rate. So in areas of high house values, it's an invaluable tool, the community land trust, to, in a sense, deflate house price values and to allow for the creation of affordable housing. Mostly the demand is for rental housing through that mechanism, but it can be for shared ownership, where the community will retain a share in the house for the long term, but the owner-occupier can gradually increase their own stake up to, say, 80%. Yeah, we hosted, with support from the Carnegie UK Trust, a national demonstration project for community land trusts in I think it was around 2007-8. And that was really to see if it was an American model that a couple of people in the UK had become really interested in and wanted to see if it would work within the context of England and its laws and culture, if you like. So we hosted a national demonstration project. And following on from that, we then became the hosts in Wessex. And I should explain, Wessex is, for us purposes, not for everybody else's, it's 3 counties. It's Devon, Dorset and Somerset that we're operating in. And we hosted a sub-regional support project to explore how we could get more traction for the community land trust idea. And that proved pretty successful. It was an action research project initially with 2-year funding, but we managed to extend it into a 3-year project. And during that time, we got a lot of engagement and buy-in and did our first 12 projects that we supported in communities in the 3 counties. And that really, I think, from that moment, community land trust as a concept took off. And we felt when we applied to Friends Provident for the Building Communities project that the basis of an organisation in a village that had already delivered a really significant project like affordable housing was a really good basis to then go on and do something else. So we wanted to explore how a community organisation could go on to do perhaps a second and third project. And in addition, Wessex has been, since its inception, a registering organisation with the Financial Conduct Authority for the legal model that most community land trusts use, which is called a Community Benefit Society. And so a stream of our work has been to register community benefit societies, some of which are community land trusts, but others aren't. And I mean, the building we're sitting in here now is a community-owned workspace, which also is a community benefit society, which started using Wessex model rules. So we included in our remit for the Friends Provident work a set of community benefit societies who weren't necessarily doing housing, but were doing other work. But the same principle of the communities owning the asset and democratically controlling the use of resources. There's a good range of organisations who've chosen to use the Community Benefit Society model in addition to community land trusts. And I mean, to give you an example, we registered Exeter Local Food, which then opened a shop and cafe selling local food, locally sourced food from sustainable sources, called the Real Food Store. And that's been running now for 7 years in Exeter. They've just moved premises, and they're working in conjunction with a social enterprise who runs the library in Exeter. They now run a cafe there, and they've also got a shop. So that's a good example. Another one is the community farm operating in the Chew Valley outside Bristol, where they grow organic vegetables, marketing them directly through box schemes, and do other commercial growing projects, but also work with people with mental health issues, so on the sort of, I think it's termed care farming principle. So they're a multiple delivery organisation, but using land and food growing as their basis. So